Hi, Kieran here with a new YouTube channel dedicated to everything that matters to Shopify partners. These videos will explore technical, business and ecosystem topics that range from in-the-weeds development issues, how to market your app, and even how to recruit support staff. In an upcoming video series, I'll explore 2020-01, the latest version of the Shopify API released on January the 1st this year. This version is packed full of releases from Unite 2019, so there's going to be plenty to dig into and explore, including order editing and the media APIs. Click subscribe and then hit the notification bell to be the first to know that these videos are posting. Before we dive into 2020-01's release notes, in this first video I want to explore API versioning in a bit more detail. I'm going to walk you through what API versioning is, why Shopify have implemented it, how they've implemented it, and what it means for app developers in reality. So let's start with what API versioning is. Essentially, API versioning represents a line in the sand, where the author publishes a specification that they guarantee will not change until the unsupported date of that version. Versions are typically published on a timeline, so this provides predictability in terms of schedule for both parties. But it also provides predictability in terms of applications not breaking due to a specification change. With that in mind, let's discuss why Shopify introduced API versioning. Shopify's rate of development is extraordinary, with approaching 1,000 developers in-house that between them push almost 400 PRs a day to production. With all those PRs come a huge amount of change, both on the product side and in terms of the code base itself. It's therefore almost impossible for an internal developer at Shopify to consider making a change to a significant component of the platform without first considering its impact on the public APIs. If the new feature or change the developer's working on introduces a change to the API specification, then Shopify's pre-versioning approach was to gauge impact of that change on app developers by using logging on the affected endpoint. Shopify would then contact the list of impacted app developers and communicate exactly the information they need to know to update their applications. Whilst this approach is effective because all app developers using an affected endpoint are informed of the change, it's also quite time-consuming and limits the pace of internal development. The impact on REST APIs is also notoriously difficult to gauge. Unlike GraphQL, REST delivers an entire payload back to every request that it receives. This means there's no granularity in terms of which fields are being used by which developers. To mitigate these problems, Shopify launched API versioning in April 2019. Their goal for the project was to provide predictable cadence to their releases and to allow their internal developers to understand the pace at which they can develop and release new features. It also provides predictability for external developers and allows them to go to market with Shopify when new features launch. Now that we've got a bit more context on the what and the why, let's dig into the how and look at Shopify's versioning implementation. Firstly, it's important to highlight which APIs are being versioned. In the case of Shopify, only the GraphQL Admin API, the REST Admin API, and the Storefront API are currently versioned. That means the Ajax API, the Scripts API, and Liquid, for example, are not versioned. Shopify release a new API version quarterly. API versions are named with a date stamp. For example, the current version, 2020-01, which was released on the 1st of January 2020, and the next version will be 2020-04, released on the 2nd of April 2020. Each version is supported for 12 months, so version 2020-01 will be supported until 2021-01. On each release date, the latest stable release is published, alongside what they call an RC, a release candidate. This version contains upcoming releases in the next version of the API. So, when version 2020-01 was released, version 2020-04 RC was also released. This gives developers an insight into what's coming down the pipeline. This graphic produced by the docs team at Shopify illustrates exactly how versioning works really clearly. You can see that in this example, 2019-04 is released as stable alongside 2019-07 RC, shown in turquoise. Then, as 2907 moves into stable on July 1st, 2019-10 RC becomes available. This diagram also introduces the concept of unstable. You can consider this the development branch of the API. Unlike the other versions, this version is in constant flux. Features may be added or removed from unstable at any time. Things may be broken, your app should never use unstable in production. Unstable is most often used in conjunction with a feature that's in developer preview. This means that Shopify have released the feature to be used by developers ahead of a public release to merchants. It's always interesting to poke around in the GraphQL schema for Unstable because you get a little insight into what might be coming down the pipeline, but remember, features that enter Unstable may be removed, so it's not necessarily an indicator of what Shopify are about to release. Now that we've got a good idea of how Shopify API versioning works, let's think about a little bit more about practical concerns and how we actually declare which version we want to use in our code. Versions are explicitly declared in the URL of the API request. For example, the REST admin API would live at /admin/API/version name/endpoint. This approach means that in most cases you're going to want to declare the version of the API that you want to use in your app's config. However, it does introduce some flexibility, allowing you to declare a specific version for a specific request. With every response from the API, you'll receive an X Shopify API version header declaring which version of the API has responded to your request. This way, you're able to make sure that you're making requests to the correct API version. If you declare no version at all in your URL, then Shopify will simply serve up the oldest supported version of the API. In this case, 2019-04. If you request a version that is no longer supported, again, Shopify will simply serve up the oldest supported version of the API. Before we continue, let's recap 5 key points. 1. Only the admin APIs and the storefront API are versioned. 2. Shopify releases 4 new versions of the API every year, at the beginning of January, April, July, and October. 3. Each of these versions are accompanied by a release candidate for the next version of the API. 4. Each version is supported for a total of 12 months. And 5. Because you have 3 months between versions, that means you only have 9 months from the introduction of a change that impacts your application to update your app to the new behavior. Let's talk a little bit about what this means for your code base. Well, if you're using one of the supported libraries, or you're using one of the well-maintained third-party libraries, then you're probably going to find this pretty straightforward. If you're using the Shopify API gem, then you simply have to pass in a version name when you instantiate a new session. If you're using the Shopify app gem, then you just need to add a version name to your config in your application. If you're using the Python library, then you simply need to pass in a version name when you instantiate a new session, exactly the same way as the Ruby gem. And if you're using the PHP library, then you'll need to set a API version in your config array. For developers using Node, the Node module exposes an API version option, which you just need to assign a string of the version name you wish to use. So as you can see, if you're using one of these libraries, it's relatively easy to get started, but I will of course leave all the links to the relevant libraries in the description box below. If you're not using one of these libraries, then you simply need to add the API version name to the URL that you're passing to your HTTP client library. So hopefully that gives you a good overview of API versioning at Shopify. As I said, in our next video, we'll dig into the release notes of 2020-01, the latest version of the API. In the meantime, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to drop them into the comments below. And remember to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to be the first to know about new videos posted to our channel. So until the next video, cheers!